Hi, it's Seavey and Perry on Culture. I'm Todd Seavey. And, amongst other things going on in the culture, the hipsters are very excited in the past few weeks because Wes Anderson has a new movie out.
Why do you want to be a lobby boy?
Who wouldn't? At the Grand Budapest, sir.
And so my life began. Junior lobby boy in training under the strict command of Monsieur Gustave H. Many of the hotel's most valued and distinguished guests came for him.
I love you.
I love you. She was dynamite in the sack, by the way.
She was 84.
I've had older.
This was also when I met Agatha.
She's charming. She's so charming.
Is he flirting with you?
Yes.
I approve of this union.
I became his pupil, and he was to be my counselor and guardian.
The police are here.
Tell them I'll be right down.
And it might be his most Wes Anderson-y movie ever. Grand Budapest Hotel has Ray Fiennes as a hotel staffer who's caught up in the midst of fascist and anti-fascist intrigue and a murder mystery. It's got an immense cast and a lot of wacky characters, and it annoyed the hell out of me. And I almost fell asleep repeatedly. I assume the hip folk at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, where I saw it, were for the most part happy with it. But I just felt like it was so mannered and so affected, it actually made his earlier movies look fairly naturalistic and conventional. On the other hand, I think he's getting visually more brilliant. Almost every shot was like a cartoon, but even I, who love comic books, can get annoyed with that eventually. So it was all very affected and twee and like a Decemberist's video. At the same time, I don't know that I want to discourage someone like Wes Anderson because Lord knows there are a lot of terrible, boring, repetitive Hollywood movies out there, and at least he's trying to do something different. Likewise, I felt a little bit guilty that I really didn't like the time travel movie Looper by Rian Johnson, who seems to have been heavily influenced by Wes Anderson. At least he's stylish and doing something different, but Looper's time travel plot was absurd, and as many of you may know, or at least the 10,000 people who saw it, Looper was based on the premise that in the near future time travel is invented, but the only thing it gets used for is so the mob can quietly dispose of bodies. I find this rather implausible.
Completely legit.
Yeah, that psychological premise was harder to buy than the technology itself, which you just have to accept as a sci-fi fan, I guess.
I'm still getting over your first impression of this Wes Anderson. A Wes Anderson film that's twee and mannered. I just can't possibly imagine that. It's funny that you should mention that, though, because I was having a conversation with someone who actually saw this film, unlike me, over the weekend, and she came to the complete opposite conclusion, even though she claims to have nothing but disdain for Wes Anderson in general and his previous films. Like you said, they're very mannered and twee. Most of the people that praise them for their, as you said, their aesthetic value, the cinematography, perhaps the snappy dialogue, the patter between characters, but don't really have much to say in the way of content. And her premise was that it was actually the narrative, the plot line was a lot more substantive. I don't know if you could elaborate on that, but do you think that's true? Or
it was complicated, at least, and it involved basically a fictional country around World War II, and in a way conveyed the very conservative message that there was a sort of beautiful pre-war culture that was being lost as the fascists took over. So our Ray Fiennes' main character would like to be focusing on stuff like beautiful women and men. He's bi and. Keeping up order and civility and beauty in the hotel, and instead he has to run around in the snow and try to escape fascist police.
So there was a political subtext to the film.
Yep. And I will say, it pains me deeply to have to complain about the hipsters in a way, because it's so tempting to try to channel their conservative impulses in a political direction I like. I mean, if you think about it, movies like this, or for that matter, Half the Hipsters in Brooklyn, are filled with detritus from like decades earlier. You know, they love to collect old things. They love the vintage clothing. This movie is filled with sort of mannered references to the 19th and early 20th century, but it's still kind of annoying. And I can't help feeling that all of it, like sort of a jewelry collection strewn out on a table, is meant to distract us from the fact that there isn't anything too substantive going on underneath. On the bright side, he's getting a lot better at sort of framing pictures so that they look like a painting, and there are amazing, weird, kooky symmetries in some of the shots, and that was impressive. It sort of makes me wish he would just...
he would quit directing and stick to cinematography, perhaps.
Or do something where there's not much pretense of it being more than visual, like make a superhero movie, perhaps. Or what might be better suited to his talents, he could do steampunk. In fact, this movie is so twee and old-fashioned and mannered, it kind of felt like steampunk. You kept expecting people to pull out blunderbusses.
I want roadblocks at every junction for 50 kilometers. I want rail blocks at every train station for 100 kilometers.
Get in!
I want 50 men and 10 bloodhounds ready in 5 minutes.
You can't arrest him simply because he's a bloody immigrant.
Take your hands off my lobby boy!
I guess I agree to a certain extent. He's not, by any stretch of the imagination, my favorite director, and I agree. There is much more style than substance in almost every single film that he's directed. On the other hand, I can't come down on him too critically, because so much of what Hollywood produces, as you alluded to, is just complete and utter dreck and indigestible. It's barely watchable, whereas his films, at the very least, they're entertaining for the hour and a half, 2 hours that you're there to.
But speaking of old-fashioned things the hipsters like, you're sort of a folk fan, aren't you?
Yeah, you could describe me as a folkie, a little bit. It didn't happen recently, but Pete Seeger, of course, Pete Seeger's passing has been much remarked upon, and there are two main critiques of Pete Seeger. One is a philosophical, ethical critique, and the other is aesthetic, a critique of the way he produced music. Politically, he was a member of the Communist Party from the 1930s through the 1950s, and not even a naive wave. He was basically he was a Stalinist, more or less. He supported Stalin, and one of the main criticisms leveled against him in the wake of his death was that prior to the onset of World War II, he supported the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. And he even produced a record, which is, in retrospect, it's a very good record. If you listen to it today, it has some fantastic songs.
Like The Nazis Are Our Friends?
Yes.
Was that one of them?
Way to go, Adolf. No, it's essentially an anti-war record. And it has anti-FDR songs like Plow Under, which is a criticism. It's a pretty astute analogy between FDR's futile agricultural policies, where they plowed under land, and his seeming eagerness to get involved in World War II.
Remember when the AAA killed 1 million hogs a day? Instead of hogs, it's men today. Plow the fourth one under, plow under, plow under, plow under every fourth American bar.
And 6 months after after this record was produced, of course, the Nazi Germany invades Russia during Operation Barbarossa, and of course he goes around and they pulp all of these records, and he goes on to produce an album, I believe it's called Dear Mr. President.
Now I wished I had a bushel, wished I had a peck, wished I had old Hitler with a rope around his neck. Hey, round, round, Hitler's grave, round, round we go. Gonna lay that poor boy down, he won't get up no more.
All the way throughout his life, he supported, if not communist, then socialist causes. There's even a song, and you can find this, I believe, on YouTube. It's basically a marching song for Mao Zedong's the People's Liberation Army. So politically, I don't think you can really endorse his philosophical beliefs. Any person who's analyzed them to any great degree. I mean, he renounced Stalin, but that was 50 years after Stalin had died. He wrote an equivocating letter to Ron Radosh, a former red diaper baby who wrote a great book called Commies about his association with Marxist folk musicians in the village during the 50s and 60s. He wrote a letter to Ron Radosh saying more or less, well, Stalin, it turns out he wasn't such a great guy, but he left it at that. He didn't really seem to grasp the political import of what he was doing during the 30s. So the political criticism, I think, has a lot of merit.
And he was still at it right up to the end, right? He sang to Occupy Wall Street.
He did sing to Occupy Wall Street. In fact, there's a very amusing anecdote about that, which was recounted by a writer in the L.A. Weekly after his death. He essentially, what happened, he went down to Occupy Wall Street, and he was trying to sing classic Pete Seeger tunes like...
The Nazis are our friends.
Yes. And like any good folk hootenanny, he tried to incorporate the audience into the performance, and of course no one in the audience had any idea what these... At one point, these were universally known songs in terms of popular music, and none of them had any idea what he was doing. And this writer made the point that this illustrated to a certain extent the schism between Pete Seeger's folk activism and the more contemporary activism of the modern day left.
I suppose you can't expect a man in his 90s to remain completely relevant, but he had a big impact while he was around. I'd be interested to know if the people who were down at Zuccotti Park protesting as part of Occupy would have been more familiar with modern folk rocker Jeff Mangum from Neutral Milk Hotel. And the reason I ask about him specifically is that his wife was actually one of the Occupy organizers and one of the editors of the Occupy Gazette that they distributed and collected into a book in 2011. So maybe if instead of going up there and singing "If I Had a Hammer," maybe if someone had gone up there and sung "Two-Headed Boy," then they all would have.
Or he could have covered a song by the Decemberists, perhaps.
The Decemberists, yes. Another thing some of the hippie types really loved back in the 60s was Dune. I think everyone should love Dune. I think it's arguably the best sci-fi novel ever written, but it presents a more convincing than usual, elaborately realized planet that combines ecology and tradition. So I think there are reasons for both conservatives interested in tradition and environmentalists to find the novel fascinating. And there's a documentary just recently out called Jodorowsky's Dune, about the Chilean-French director Alejandro Jodorowsky, who in the 1970s very nearly produced a movie version of Dune.
Mi ambición fue tremenda. I wanted to make something sacred, una película que diera las alucinaciones de LSD. Si tomara LSD to change the young mind of all the world.
And of course, the whole thing started going over budget, and Hollywood, which was supposed to put up part of the funding, was panicked in part by practical issues like the fact that Jodorowsky wanted it to be 12 hours long. And here we thought David Lynch was insane for doing an initial cut that was about 4 hours long.
3,000 drawings. I shoot the picture, point of view, movement of the camera, dialogue.
Designing the spaceships, the clothes, the whole look of his world.
The castle. Open the mouth. The spaceship came in the tongue.
His vision was so huge, so beyond what anybody else was doing at that time. Things that George Lucas wasn't even going to try with Star Wars. It's enormous.
So what do you think was the fatal flaw? Is this akin to Stanley Kubrick's Napoleon project? It was just too overly ambitious to begin with?
I think the short explanation is that both Jodorowsky and Lynch are insane, or pardon me, surrealists, but it's pretty close to being insane. And it is interesting that they're somewhat similar directors. I mean, they both admire surrealism. In fact, Jodorowsky wanted the evil emperor in his version to be played by Salvador Dali himself, and Dali actually agreed, although he had a couple of strange conditions according to the documentary. He wanted there to be a giraffe on fire in one scene, and they agreed. And
an effigy of a giraffe or an actual giraffe trucked in from
it wasn't clear. I mean, it was the 70s, so I don't know if animal welfare standards in continental Europe are quite as high.
I was going to say, the ASPCA probably would have had a problem with that.
I'm going to hope that they were just going to use a fake giraffe. On the other hand, you know, they slaughtered that giraffe in front of children in Germany just recently, so I don't know if
the Danes, yes.
Or the Danes, sorry. The Danes are our friends. So maybe the continental Europeans don't mind doing scary things to animals quite as much as some of the vegans in the U.S. do. I was going to say, so I think the problem is Jodorowsky and Lynch were both thinking too much like surrealists. And in Jodorowsky's case, he was changing the plot in weird ways, like he was going to have Dune itself fly around the galaxy trying to rescue people. He was going to kill Paul Atreides at the end. He was going to have a whole sequence involving the camera going up Paul's mother's vagina as he was conceived. I think it was going to be very odd. David Lynch's problem, I would contend, was actually overly slavish devotion to the novel. I don't know if this is a popular view of what went wrong, but I actually saw the movie as a kid before I read the novel, and I thought, when I read the novel, I'd realized Lynch had gone horribly awry. But I think his real mistake is every minuscule plot twist in that elaborate novel he tried to squeeze into the dialogue or the narration, and it was just too much.
I didn't read Dune, but I have a friend who said it was fantastic.
Amusingly, Jodorowsky, who's in his 80s, made one very un-PC and funny comment about his overall attitude toward Frank Herbert's novel. In the documentary, you see Jodorowsky say, "You can't just leave it there pristine. You have to rape the novel, tear off its clothing." And so he pretty much admits he was raping
He has
Dune.
a point.
If I were making an elaborate production of Lord of the Rings, by the way, the only change I would make to the text is instead of having them at a hobbit-filled tavern, I would, of course, set it in the Lockyard, the wonderful bar where we are now here in Brooklyn. Thanks for watching us. Thanks to the Lockyard for having us. And I hope you'll watch future Seavey Perry on Culture videos.
See you next time.